sick of all these transgender activists and their outrageous demands of basic human dignity and cyborg conversion states? Well, me too. I used to be an ugly, dumb, soy-chugging cuck, but even I can see that these gender terrorists are going too far. I mean, children? You can't be teaching this stuff to kids. If children are allowed to explore their own gender identity, they might not do what we know biology tells them to do. And it looks like I'm not alone. Some brave gays have broken the mind spell of the left and realized that you don't need to side against political parties who hate your very existence. As should be apparent by my severe new haircut, I won't just sit around while radical ideologues threaten my Christian God-given constitutional rights, the most important and least ironic of which is our steadfast adherence to logic and reason. Hang on, I'm not dressed for this. This is the old me. Definitely more conservative, but I think I can do better. There we go. That's manly. Maybe a little too manly. There we go. Load up the logic cannon, because I'm ready to fire. Look, I wore sweatpants to work for 10 years. This really is the best you're going to get from me. Unfortunately, since human beings are currently living in a fallen state, common sense just isn't enough anymore. Luckily, my time in the dark as a lefty swidge clued me in on just where I can go to get my daily suppository of facts without the side effects of feelings.
Yes. Where she came from. She's a fucking Kardashian, okay? She's a giant Kardashian.
That's right.
That's what she is. Now, notice I'm saying she.
You're saying she. I would say
very politically correct.
Yeah, I'm not.
Yes, finally. I was lucky enough to find out how gender functions in our society when I listened to Rogan's lectures on The Man Show.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to get a vasectomy because it would possibly diminish the size of the load. And looking at a big puddle is one of my favorite parts of the act.
Even to a 13-year-old, it was obvious that Rogan had it all figured out, so I can't wait to see what new insights I'll gain today as an objectively masculine man.
I didn't have a dog in this fight. I was completely open and liberal about it until there was a case where a man who had been a man for 30 years became a woman for a little less than 2 years and then started MMA fighting women.
Yes, exactly.
Beating the fuck out of these women and not proclaiming that he or she used to be a man because in quotes, it was a medical condition that I did not need to disclose. Like, that's not a fucking medical condition.
Right.
And if you ever watch the fights, she wasn't winning.
Is this Fallon Fox?
Yes.
Yeah.
She wasn't winning because she was skillful. She was fucking manhandling these women. It was ugly.
Of course.
It was.
This is an outrage. I can't believe that the trans radicals are basing their entire movement around this one woman's career in a combat sport. The UFC is no place for this kind of violence. I mean, look at Fox just absolutely dismantle this poor woman. Clearly, anecdotes are all we need to know the facts. Still, it's good to have science on our side too, so I'm glad acclaimed scientist and climate change real estate expert Ben Shapiro is there to deliver the knockout punch to put feelings down for the count. That was a fighting pun, the manliest of all jokes.
It's a condition. I mean,
Right.
the DSM called it gender identity disorder, and then they called it gender dysphoria. It's a condition. I mean, like, I'm not saying conditions don't exist.
Dysphoria. But that, in a lot of people's mind, is labeling it somehow or a negative.
Well, I mean, it is highly linked to suicidality. There's a 40% lifetime suicide rate for people who have this particular gender disorder. That seems to me not to be like a great positive.
Whether or not they transition, yeah.
Whether or not they transition, yeah.
Now, when people say that there's this 40% suicide rate amongst transgender people, one of the arguments that I've heard is it's because they're not accepted.
Right, I've heard this too, yeah.
Yeah, and that if they were accepted and then they felt themselves and they felt loved for their true self, then it would be just like everybody else.
And I've seen no evidence to suggest that. If there is a decrease based on treatment, then it's marginal at best.
Yeah, get him, Ben. I mean, we all know the science of gender already. I mean, it wouldn't be science if it wasn't immediately obvious to us. But here he's made 3 specific claims. 1. Trans people commit suicide at a rate of 40%. 2. This holds up whether they've transitioned or not. And 3. Bullying and discrimination have nothing to do with that. He doesn't mention where he got that 40% statistic from, but luckily, despite the fact that all the big tech companies are silencing conservatives, somehow that epic college student smackdown he mentions ended up in my recommendations sidebar. In this instant classic, not only does he give us the same 3 truths he told Joe Rogan, but he name drops where the study came from, the Williams Institute at UCLA. But here at Django's Science Channel for Rational Lads, we pride ourselves on going to the primary sources to make sure people like Ben don't leave anything out. And as luck would have it, you can access this study in full for free. Link it in the description. Now, research articles can be really long and dense, and you can't fault someone too much for occasionally messing up some minor details. After all, you'd have to be paying very close attention to see the word attempts in giant letters on the title page. A further clue is hidden away right underneath it, because surveys are generally not given to people who have committed suicide. So, Ben, I know you'd want to know if you got one of your facts wrong, but suicide rate and attempted suicide rate don't actually mean the same thing, and that's not just semantics. In fact, this article makes it very clear on page 4 that suicide attempts should not be a proxy measurement for suicide completion. For example, men are 80% of completions, but women are 75% of attempts. So just having information on the latter doesn't necessarily tell you the former. And I know, you can't trust these SJW studies to tell you the truth, unless you already knew the truth and they're saying that. But just like our boy Ben, they cite their sources, so you can go and check to find out that yes, they were representing those sources accurately. When you do that, you see things like even the most high-risk groups admitted to a hospital following a suicide attempt are thankfully more likely than not to still be around 20 or 30 years later. Add to that the Williams survey can't say whether their one question, have you ever attempted suicide, pulled in affirmative answers from people who wouldn't have met the standards for an attempt in that study. Well, okay, that's just one point. Let's move on.
There's a 40% lifetime suicide rate for people who have this particular gender disorder. That seems to me not to be like a great positive.
Whether or not they transition, yeah.
Whether or not they transition, yeah.
All right, this isn't fair. I just read all the way down to page 4, so I can't hate on Ben too much for not being as intimately familiar with the source he's citing as I am, but Ben, this is directly refuted on page 3. This study didn't ask when the attempt happened, so someone who felt like shit, attempted suicide, then transitioned and felt way better would still show up as a yes. Like, word for word, the authors of this study are saying the exact opposite of what you claim they say, and that's not great. Sort of what you might call a not fact.
One of the arguments that I've heard is it's because they're not accepted.
Right, I've heard this too, yeah.
Yeah, and that if they were accepted and then they felt themselves and they felt loved for their true self, then it would be just like everybody else.
And I've seen no evidence to suggest that.
Okay, Ben, I know that stats are complicated and that there are a lot of complex formulas that even a Harvard law grad might not be able to fully understand, but you should still be able to tell which numbers are bigger. This is your study. You used it so many times.
But specifically regarding the UCLA study, it actually suggests that when people are in supportive environments, their suicide attempt rates go down. You said that you do not believe feeding into their, quote, delusion will support them. How do you respond to the UCLA study you yourself used, suggesting that it in fact does?
So a lot of these, so I don't tend to believe self-reported studies about treatment, meaning that how people treat you. Questionnaire studies are not as good as behavioral studies.
But you trust self-reported suicide attempts?
Because I have read the studies and I can have an opinion on them.
Did you? Should you, Ben? Okay, rough start. Never idolize your heroes. Learn that the hard way. Oh well, no big loss. I've only ever interacted with Ben once, back when I was a hardcore social justice necromancer. He's not who won me over to the side of facts and logic. Nope, that honor goes to Mikey Harlow, one of the principal speakers at the recent Walkaway LGBT Town Hall, who took time out of his busy schedule of not being silenced in any way, shape, or form to try and reach across the aisle and save me from the leftist indoctrination that I must have gone through. After all, if 80% of a demographic votes a certain way, it must be because of lies and fear. The best way to know when you're right is to look at how many people hate you. As with every reformed swidge, Mikey just couldn't ignore the facts anymore. And even though he slipped a little bit and showed me a screenshot of an article that, when I googled it, actually refuted his point in the very next paragraph, recovered and gave me an actual list of 12 studies proving that most kids who experience gender confusion grow out of it. The article he links is from scipost.org, but the actual list of the 12 studies he's talking about is one link further in. Whatever, I know he's not hateful or bigoted, so I'll assume he was just too anxious to give me the facts to link to the correct thing. And that thing is a blog post by Dr. James Cantor, so let's look at these 12 studies that... One of them is an unpublished dissertation, so that's not... Well, we know that colleges are just cultural Marxist recruiting centers nowadays, so if anything, not being published is a point in its favor. Since when is peer review important for validity? This one, well... He seems to think that you're not really gay if you haven't touched someone else's naughty bits yet, and that we get to count asexual people and gay virgins as straight, and that if you weren't diagnosed with something, we can still count you as no longer having it. You know what? I'm not on his committee. This is taken away from the bigger picture. Plus, I always admire someone who can appreciate the classics. Of all these studies, only 4 of them are from after 2008, and the other 7 are from 1987 or before. Wait, that's 11. Mike said there were 12. The article he linked me said there were 12. There's only 11. Nope. There I go again, getting caught up on things like numbers. Gotta focus on the facts. This one I can only get a preview for, but only 5 of the 9 kids completed the study, so why is he claiming that none of them were trans and all 9 were gay? This one... Oh, all male homosexuality begins with effeminate behavior. Not a great look right there in the abstract. But we're here for trans kids, not homosexuality. Which... Where is he getting this 2 out of 45 number from? Best I can tell it's from this paragraph, but this was a study done on gay kids, not trans kids, so why is he including it in his list of 11 studies that show desistance rates? Same with this one. It's on effeminate boys, not trans... Ooh, malignant personality disorder. That's not neutral scientific language. At least this one's actually about trans kids, but it was only on 10, and 6 of them were receiving psychotherapy in 1986, which wasn't controlled for in the study. Oh, speaking of which, this one was specifically about how gender-disturbed children were treated with therapy to stop it. So maybe you got this one mixed up with your list of successful conversion therapy studies? Again, effeminate boys, not trans... Holy shit, maybe there's a reason we don't look at studies on gender and sexuality from 50 years ago. Okay, this one actually discusses desistance in trans kids without calling them sissies or mentioning deviancy, and it spends the entire introduction ripping apart like every other study he's mentioned. It also says that a quarter of the kids they measured didn't meet the threshold for diagnosis, so again, you can't desist from a thing from which you were not persisting. They also thought it was fair to assume that the 10 kids whose parents filled out their forms for them were definitely part of the desistance group. Lastly, this one. From the same damn gender clinic in the Netherlands as the previous study, the only clinic of its kind in the country as of 2008, counted all 80 of the adolescents who didn't return for the study as desisters. So they straight up assumed that everybody who stopped seeking treatment did it because... That's not how you do medical studies. That's not how you do any study. You're supposed to make as few assumptions as... Okay, Mike. Half of these studies are not on the thing your source claims they are. Half of them have dog shit methods with tiny sample sizes. And 64%, that's 7 out of 11, by the way, that's how that works, were conducted at a time when less than half of Americans thought consensual gay relationships should be legal. The guy who compiled this list, and the one you're getting that 60 to 90% statistic from, didn't read the studies he's... Nope, that's anger, that's feelings, and we all know that you only get angry when you don't have facts to back you up, so there must be something I missed. I couldn't find a copy of The Sissy Boy Syndrome online, so let's activate my university powers and snag a copy. Alright, here we go. You know, despite the title, this study is actually really sympathetic towards most of the kids involved, especially when you consider that the author, Richard Green, began his initial assessments in the mid-60s. The thing is, like a lot of the studies mentioned above, that 1 out of 44 trans number isn't telling you the whole story. Gender identity disorder, which is what the DSM used before they switched it to gender dysphoria, wasn't an official diagnosis until 1980, 7 years after the study concluded, so none of these kids were diagnosed with the thing that Cantor is claiming they grew out of. The book itself was published in 1987, so it attempts a post hoc rationalization of why the boys in Green's study could probably be compared to the new 1980 GID status, but his sources for that are a 1973 study on gender-disturbed boys who should get therapy if they don't like the right sports, and a 1981 PhD dissertation that seems to have fallen off the face of the earth. Not only that, but the effeminate boys they got for this study were there because their parents were concerned about their cross-gender behaviors, and most took steps to correct them. Again, this book is mostly about homosexuality, not gender dysphoria, which, remember, was not a thing yet. And cross-gender behavior in the 1960s could have amounted to things like liking Cinderella or wanting cooking utensils, stuff that just wouldn't be applicable to diagnosing gender dysphoria today. And the sheer amount of active repression you see in the interviews with these kids, hi Booker, thanks for ruining that shot. And the sheer amount of active repression you see in the interviews with these kids 15 years down the road it's pretty bad, especially one in particular. I'm still trying to make sense of all this, so I got in touch with an old contact from my days on the SJW dark web, doctoral student and director of debate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, CV. I knew they'd be able to help me with the rhetorical strategy I would need to destroy my opponents without having to use facts, but when I asked him to look at those 11 studies to find the best way to spin them against trans kids, Instead, they told me this. One of the reasons gender identity disorder was a bad diagnosis is because it logically required a clean transition from one binary gender to another and a complete assimilation into the roles associated with it. And that's a good point. Trying to put ratios on these studies forces you into using a binary where you're either fully transitioned into a clinician's idea of the gender you weren't assigned at birth, or you've desisted into the only other option, which in Cantor's summary would be cis. Reading through these follow-up interviews, it seems like a good deal of the 43 men that Cantor reported as cis still enjoyed and fantasized about feminine behaviors, so were they really trans and just hiding it? I mean, they don't seem to hate being men, or at least got really good at working not to hate it, so they weren't fully cis. Is gender a spectrum? Alright, so this hasn't gone as expected. The facts don't seem to back up the people who love facts the most. But if there's one thing I've learned in my 17 minutes of being a right-wing reactionary, it's not to let a lack of evidence get in the way of knowing the truth. So let me slip back just a little bit into my old ways and see if I can think of the thing that triggered me the most. Some irrefutable source of evidence that my tiny SJW brain just couldn't counter. Sweden. Yes, that's the one. So let's Google Sweden transgender study, and there it is. Hey, what's this second result? Sex reassignment doesn't work. Here's the evidence. That sounds way easier than reading the study. Let's see what this article has to say about it. Ryan Anderson, PhD. But since he's being hosted on the Heritage Foundation's website, you know he's not one of those lefty-feely doctors. He even has 3 key takeaways I could basically stop reading right now. So, just scrolling down the article, I already see 4 links to what I assume are PhD quality sources. Finally, I think we found the one. Oh wow, he's even got Dr. Paul McHugh from the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine to explain that... Oh, never mind, not what I came for. And, there it is, a link to the Sweden study. According to Ryan, PhD heritage man, the study which, quote, extending over 30 years and conducted in Sweden, where the culture is strongly supportive of the transgendered, documents their lifelong mental unrest. 10 to 15 years after surgical reassignment, the suicide rate of those who had undergone sex reassignment surgery rose to 20 times that of their comparable peers. You know what? I'm just going to believe that. I've read literally 11 studies in an entire book already. I think I've earned a break. Just gonna take this guy at his word.
Here's another longitudinal study. This is a cohort study from Sweden. It was released in 2011 and covered sex reassignment surgeries from 1973 to 2003.
Fine, I'll read the damn study. But I'm only looking for those 2 claims. 1, that Sweden is strongly supportive of the transgendered, and 2, that suicide rates for people who got sex confirmation surgery rose to 20 times that of their comparable peers, which I assume means trans people who elected not to get the surgery. Alright, the study looked at 324 sex reassigned persons from 1973 to 2003, and compared them to a control group matched for age and birth sex? That can't be right. I mean, that's fine if that's your control group, but Anderson claimed that... Okay, let's read on. In the abstract, it does say that persons with transsexualism after sex reassignment have considerably higher risks for mortality and suicidal behavior. That part is true. Scrolling down to the results section, on Table 2, we do see that the overall rate of death for the cases was roughly 3 times higher than that of the controls, and death by suicide was indeed more than 20 times higher, so Anderson was right about that. So let's check his claim on societal attitudes. Just Control F, societal attitude. Easy, there it is. Wait, altered societal attitudes? Let's check that reference. It's a study done in 1998 on Swedish views of transsexualism, which I guess we'd still need to view as the same thing as being transgender, and it does report some pretty favorable rates, so good on you, Sweden. But 98 is at the tail end of their study. It leaves out 25 years. This study says that previous research on societal views towards trans people was scarce, but what research they did have suggested that even in Sweden, views were way more restrictive during the bulk of the time their study takes place. Hang on, let's go back to that paragraph. The overall mortality rate was only significantly increased for the group operated before 1989, which might be explained by improved healthcare for trans persons during the 90s? Wait, you mean to tell me that outcomes for a surgery in 1970 and one in 1990 might be different? Let's scroll down the discussion section a little bit. Comparing sex reassigned persons with matched population controls, and that was matched with cis people, remember, no inferences can be drawn as to the effectiveness of sex reassignment as a treatment for transsexualism. In other words, the results should not be interpreted such as sex reassignment per se increases morbidity and mortality. Things might have been even worse without sex reassignment. That means Anderson's claim that negative outcomes post-surgery rose to 20 times that of comparable peers is a lie. The important variable here for trans people is the surgery, so when he uses this study to say that surgery raises mental unrest, he's flat out wrong. The researchers even cite other studies that suggest that sex reassignment for trans people improves quality of life and gender dysphoria. This can't be it. This can't be... Hold on. Anderson subtly mentions a few times in his Heritage Foundation article that he's written a book responding to the transgender movement. An entire book! They don't let just anyone publish a book without being an expert on the topic. So I bought it. I paid money for this book so I could talk about it in the video. Finally, this is what I've been looking for. 250 digital pages of facts and sources and sound arguments completely free of hysterical emotion. He's going to clarify the mistakes he made in the Sweden study, and he's going to give me all the research proving that trans people are wrong and don't actually deserve rights. I just know it. Okay, it's been a losing strategy so far, but it's all I know, so Control F Sweden. Yep, cited in the introduction. Just click and... oh no. There it is again. He's doing it. He's using the study to claim that trans people who get sex confirmation surgery have worse outcomes than those who don't, when we just saw that's not what the study says. And, oh god, right above it, there's the 41% suicide statistic again. Transitioning treatment has not been shown to reduce... That's the Williams study again. Has no one actually read that study? And above that, no, it can't be. The desisting statistic, but now he's got it at 80 to 95%. Please tell me he doesn't... He doesn't cite sexology.org, thank some God for small miracles. Instead, he sources the court case filed by the ACLU on behalf of Gavin Grimm, which, at time of writing, has just entered motions for summary judgment. And, I mean, it's not sexology.org, but it also has nothing to do with that statistic, so what's this other thing? An article by Jesse Singal. What's missing from the conversation about transgender kids? Okay, let's type that in. What's missing? Conversation. Trans kids. Okay. According to a very helpful blog post from James Cantor, I paid 17 real actual dollars for this book, and literally by page 2, he's giving me the same bullshit I've already... So what does Anderson actually say about how we should treat gender dysphoria? Well, he does have opinions. Remember Paul McHugh, the doctor from Johns Hopkins he quoted in the Heritage article? Well, Anderson is a big fan because McHugh shows up in his book 109 times. In 1979, McHugh shut down the U.S.'s first gender identity clinic based on a dubious study, and he has a well-documented and self-admitted history of transphobia. To quote him, "It was part of my intention when I arrived in Baltimore in 1975 to help end sex reassignment surgery." A pathogenic meme, 109 times. In the conclusion of his book, Anderson writes, "When I told people that I was working on a book about the transgender moment, many asked me why. Why spend precious time on something so silly? Why do diligent research and write carefully reasoned arguments about something that runs on emotion?" But what he actually put out was almost completely devoid of facts and basically entirely comprised of emotion. And I found huge sections where he goes on about the philosophy of gender and how terrible trans activists are, and a section on how Mike Pence not being able to resist female temptation is good, actually. But he never, not once, gives any scientific evidence to back up his preferred treatment of gender dysphoria, which is to tell them to not. The closest he comes is advocating for the approach developed by Dr. Kenneth Zucker for children, which consists of parents setting limits on cross-gender behavior and psychotropic drugs. The only sources he gives there are guidelines written by Zucker himself that include anecdotes, but no data on long-term outcomes. An entire book, written by a doctor who supposedly cares about facts and just wants to help trans people, and he has the same solutions as Ben Shapiro. What should you do if you're trans? You shouldn't. These guys are all feelings. They think trans people are gross, but since their entire position is dismissing the feelings of trans people, they have to pretend that facts are on their side. So they take the worst numbers and lines they can find from the same handful of studies and somehow still manage to lie about them. This isn't what I signed up for. I became a right-wing reactionary because someone I thought was weird asked me to be nice to them once. And I knew science was on my side because I saw a bunch of YouTubers telling me what I already thought while saying fact a bunch. But when I actually learned to do research myself, by which I mean typing into my university library search bar instead of Google, none of it backs up what they claim at all. So if the research doesn't say what Ben Shapiro and James Cantor and Ryan Anderson say it says, what does it say? I stopped at 5 studies here, but the trend was clear. While trans kids and adults alike are at higher risk of mental health problems compared to the general population, the benefits of socially and medically transitioning far outweigh the costs. And the drastically improved outcomes of trans people in supportive environments strongly suggest that poor mental health is not an intrinsic part of being trans or non-binary. It turns out that a dispassionate and objective look at the research will push you further away from Shapiro and Harlow and Anderson. The more you scrutinize their claims, the more skeptical you are, the more it becomes apparent that they put their feelings first, and they either only see what they want to see in the studies they cite, or they're deliberately lying to you because they assume you don't care enough about trans people to go check. Well, I care. About trans people and about science. And the science says, trans rights now. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video and thought I did a good enough job, just consider leaving a like and sharing on the Twitters and such to hopefully help push back against bad faith actors who misrepresent studies to hurt trans people. If you want to subscribe to my channel, that would be a neat thing for you to do, and I will be your friend. And always, trans rights are human rights.